Greetings and salutations, everyone. Today we're going to be taking a look at the beginning of English America, the expanse of the British to this landmass and the impacts that came with it. So, let's get started. When we look at the history of England, they were kind of late getting started as a colonial power. They had some problems in the 15th century, like who was really in charge, the War of the Roses. And then we see the rise of the Protestant Reformation in England. Are they Catholics? Are they Protestants? How different were these two groups? And then Spain tried to wipe England off the map when a Protestant queen, Queen Elizabeth, took over for a prolonged period of time. That ultimately ended with, number one, the Tudors being in charge. Number two, the Protestants being in charge. Number three, Spain losing their invincible armada to a rough storm. England learned how to be a colonial power, not from coming here, but by dealing with the Irish. Now, Ireland is very near to England, and Ireland didn't want to give up Catholicism. They believed that it was wrong for them to do. And the Protestant rulers didn't like that very much. So the government tried a couple different times, a couple different ways to bring Ireland under heel. Sometimes that meant conquering them militarily or killing of civilians. Sometimes it meant taking land. And at one point it meant bringing people to Ireland and having them live there. This idea of transplanting a populace and then hoping that the new populace would incorporate this new idea really starts here. And the term we get from this, plantation, well, if you've grown up and done any history in Texas or any American history, you've definitely seen that word somewhere before. But this is where that root word meant, a person who is transplaced somewhere else. America appealed to England for a lot of reasons. Number one, England was very overpopulated. They had started a series of enclosure movements, which meant if you had a lot of land, you would fence off the land that was your land, and then no one else can farm on that land. For the better part of a millennia, if you had land, anyone could farm on your land as long as they're paying you that luxury. It's kind of like rent. In fact, that idea is where we get the term landed lord from, or even landlord later on. If you couldn't farm anymore, if you had nowhere to go and nowhere to take any of this stuff, the idea of going elsewhere was really, really enticing. And the New World appealed to people who might have been poor, who might wanted to own land, who might wanted to have a fresh new start. Now, Spain and France sent men almost exclusively. They sent men to conquer, men to trade, men to buy, men to control. England sends whole families. They are, just like with Ireland, transplanting whole peoples. And the Chesapeake Bay was one of the first big places we see this. Virginia, Maryland are where the focus is going to be. Jamestown, 1507, first English colony. Tobacco was a big goal for this. We don't know how, but a guy named John Rolfe got himself hands on cold climate tobacco. And he starts selling it, and when he does, he's making lots of money, and he's doing it in the Americas. Tobacco is selling, well, like hotcakes. At one point, it's selling for $1,500 a bag. So anybody who could come here wanted to, knowing that they could get land cheap, they could start a new life, and that's wonderful. And if you had the means to come here, then, that's super. But if you didn't have the means to come here, then you might bind yourself to a system called indentured servitude. And indentured servants would work for a period of 5 to 7 years for someone else. You see, this was a contract that was drawn up in England before you got on a boat, before you even went to the Americas. You, a poor individual, would go to somebody who had money, had a ship, had probably land and stuff already in the Americas, and you would agree to work for that person in a specific way with specific housing for a couple of years. If you get here and he said, you agreed, okay, I will work for you in a farm, man, I'll work your farm for you. And you get here and he says, well, I don't have a farm anymore. You're going to be chopping down trees. Not a thing. Contract says farm work, so we're doing farm work. It specifically stipulated what the work was and how each party had to follow it. And if you show up and he has a farm and you agree to farm work and you don't do farm work, you will be executed. You are just as bound to this contract as he is. This might not seem appealing when you think, I have to work for someone else for free for how many years? Oh, nay, nay. But what you get out of it is at the end of it, you are free in this new world. You have, if you've been making money, you now have money. You probably could never have afforded that trip across the ocean. That transatlantic trip could take 2 months. That's 2 months of food, 2 months of water, and you land in a new place. Oh no, that's something that most people just could not afford. Land means liberty. I really cannot stress that enough. We look at most parts of history anywhere in the world, and owning land means having a voice in your government. The more land you have, the more power you have. And as large amounts of land started to become, quote unquote, available in the Americas, there was a larger need for people to work that land for you. That might mean someone who comes to be as a servant, that might be one of those indentured folks, then yes, later that would mean the slaves. The granting of a proprietor is the granting of a colony. If you are one of these individuals, you are in charge of the entire colony. And this is not like, this is closer to what would become a state than a small region. As we have established already, Spain was not nice to the Native Americans. The French really just wanted to trade with them, but the English didn't want to intermarry with them. They just wanted the native, or make them work, make the Native Americans work for the British. The British just wanted the Native Americans gone. And the Brits gained land from Native Americans through a series of treaties, some of them fair, some of them definitely not fair, through military defeats, and this continued to happen. One of the most famous times we see that a marriage takes place between a native person and an Englishman was the John Rolfe, the same guy who brought the tobacco and Pocahontas. This was very unique and very famous. The stuff that Europeaners are going to bring with them to the New World changes things forever for Native American life. We see that hunting is going to continue to be a thing, specifically with these new weapons. The arrival of alcohol really changes things for Native Americans because there was no alcohol like that, like grain alcohol, like whiskeys, scotches, even grape wine, beer. It did not exist here. It had not been developed. So if you started drinking this, it's not just you have no resistance to this and you can get drunk very quickly. It has never been in your genetic pool. So there isn't any kind of resistance to alcohol. And this is one of those things that really disrupted Native American lifestyle. When new livestock is brought in, like cows and pigs, it tears up the farmland. Forests get chopped down for lumber, for quick building materials, and then when it becomes a fleet. They're used to make ships. Jamestown suffered very quickly. This first real colony suffered real bad. In 1609, in Jamestown, it was called the Starving Times. People came here expecting to get rich, finding gold. They bring lots of tools and chemicals to find gold and silver, and they bring very little food. And in that initial winter of 1609-1610, the number of people die off very fast. 340 of the 400 initial settlers will die in that early winter. John Smith, depicted here, infamously said, it doesn't matter where you were when you came here. It doesn't matter what your station was in England. Right now, if you don't work, you won't eat. And it worked. More and more we see the goal is to get people to come here. The headright system said if you were rich or powerful, or maybe even a ship's captain, if you can get people to leave England, cross the seas, and stay in the Americas, you will be given 50 acres of land. Now, you have to get people there, and that means you have to have a lot of capital to put up all at once. So this really benefited the wealthy. In 1619, we see that more and more people arriving in the Americas leads to more and more changes. And two big events happen in that year. The first is going to be the House of Burgesses is created. This was the first of its kind, a representative government in colonial America. If you own land, you have a voice in this government. And in 1619, we also get our first ship of African slaves arriving. Now, this ship was not originally meant to go to Jamestown. It was originally going to the Caribbean, but some pirates hijacked the ship. The pirates tried to sell the slaves, and when they couldn't, the pirates just threw them all out at Jamestown and said, okay, fine, here they are, and then the pirates leave. It's a very peculiar kind of story, but sometimes history is stranger than fiction. In 1622, Pocahontas' brother attacked Virginia, and this was a brutal attack that took place. A quarter of all of Virginia was wiped out at the Uprising of 1622. And following this, the reaction of the white colonists was they needed to get rid of the Native Americans. And that was kind of what starts happening. Native American forces are pushed off and pushed farther west. The agreement was they would stay on one side, they would go far from the coast, and that would be it. And it was a very easy deal to make very quickly. Unfortunately, as time goes on, this is a deal that Native Americans continue to make and are going to continue to fall back. Tobacco made planters very wealthy. It also made the English very wealthy. The problem with tobacco, the long-term problem of tobacco, is it exhausts the land. And it forces tobacco farmers to move to different areas to grow more tobacco until the ground there is exhausted. So they have to move again to grow more tobacco. This is going to eventually lead the farmers to be in conflict with Native Americans. And most of the immigrants that we're going to see here are going to want to come into this region. So the Chesapeake Bay is going to have more and more people showing up, all wanting to get rich selling tobacco and finding they have to continually move to the area where Native Americans have been pushed to grow it. In these colonies, initially, there's a lot more men than women. 5 to 1, we see there are more men than women. If you were a woman, you were probably an indentured servant. And the law was that if you were an indentured servant, male or female, you could not get married. if you were a woman and you were an indentured servant, you might even be able to use the fact of, oh, I will marry you, but I'm in this rotten contract, oh fuss, to either A, turn the guys away, or B, get said person who has the contract to give it up a little faster. If you are going to live in the Chesapeake region, it is not the easiest of lives. Your life expectancy is about 10 years shorter than it would be back in England. And it's not that old to begin with. On average, you're looking at your early 40s. One big bonus is women had what were called dower rights, which said that if your husband died, the woman could inherit up to a third of the property the husband had. And that's great, because in a lot of other European nations at this time, if your husband died, you have whatever your children decide to give you. And that was it. Maryland was doing well. Before it was a colony, it was thriving a lot on tobacco. The proprietor of the colony was Cecilius Calver, the man who is pictured here. And he believed that Maryland, once it became a colony, was going to be a safe haven for Catholics. He believed that persecution against Catholics was not right, it was not just, so he really wanted Catholics to have a presence here where they could be safe. And very quickly, the Catholics were outnumbered by the Protestants. In 1649, we see that a new law is passed by Calver that says there is equal protection to all Christians. At this point, he's willing to accept, okay, this isn't going to be a safe haven for Catholics. Let's just make sure no one is persecuting anyone else. The Puritan movement believed that the Church of England had not gone far enough to rid itself of its Catholic background. This group believed in predestination, the Calvinists. Predestination says that you are going to go to heaven or hell. That's already been decided. Nothing you do while alive can change that. So just do your best, because, you know, if you're doing your best, you're probably going to heaven, right? That's a thought. John Winthrop writes this idea that Puritans need to be the city on a hill, the model that all others are going to look up to, but they do not believe in religious freedom for anyone else. A couple examples of this are Roger Williams, we'll talk about in a little bit, and Anne Hutchison, who they were both banished from Massachusetts Bay. Hutchison just asked, hey, can't we just treat each other with some basic civility? And she was banished, and she got bored of being banished, so she came back and she said the same thing, and then they decided to hang her. It's kind of crazy. The Mayflower Compact was drawn up on a Puritan ship that was heading here. Now, this was a contract that was decided before the ship even landed, and it said, okay, this is going to be our new society. When we landed at Plymouth, the Puritans wanted these laws to be in existence by the time that happened. One of the big components of it was an elected representative. It's not just run by a charter. You're not in charge because the king back in England tapped your shoulders with a sword. No, you're in charge because we want this person to be in charge. And infamously, this is the group that had the Thanksgiving experience. Native people came to this colony and helped them survive the first winter in exchange for the colonists helping that one Native American tribe fight another Native American tribe. And this is what we see. This is a recreation of what Plymouth looked like. I mean, you can see there's fences, but nothing meant to keep anything out bigger than maybe a person or a big dog. There's the infamous rock of Plymouth. Ooh, a rock. New England was a male-dominated society, like everywhere else was. If you got married, you had some rights, but not a whole lot. Unlike in Maryland, where you had more rights, and in Virginia, where you had lots more rights. The farther north you're going, you're seeing there's kind of a slow and subtle change to what's the accepted norm. People are going to live longer in New England than they will in the Chesapeake in Virginia, primarily because the climate's a little colder, you're having fewer diseases, and that's going to mean you can have different family structures. You're probably going to have more kids, you're going to have grandparents that are around, and most people are not moving too far from where the landing site is, so it's a very close-knit community. They also are going to really focus on learning as much as everything else. For every 50 families that came into New England, a new school was built in the region. And they were big on teaching lots of stuff. It wasn't always just reading, writing, and arithmetic. It was a lot of Bible studies too. Harvard, for example, it started as a ministry college before it became anything else. The New Englanders believed that Big G God, that Christian God, was going to favor them, was going to treat them right as long as things continued to act right and they continued to act in the best available way for the best number of people. If you wanted more land, it was based on how much you originally invested into the colonial expansion program. The towns that were built were all laid out. They're all planned. Everything is meant to be based on what society can be. If you were a shareholder in the Massachusetts Bay Company and you came here, you had a surprising amount of democratic opportunities. There was a two-house legislature. There was a governor that acted as executive branch of the colony, and you have a court system that worked independent of either the lawmakers or the executive branch. It was very important to Puritans that the government work for the people, but you didn't necessarily have to all be equal. For example, religion was one of the real tenement things. You could not act in different ways in New England, and it was not a thing. It was believed that society was based on how much God, quote unquote, loved you. If you were a strong person in your community, if you're high in the social ladder, it's because God loves you more. And if you're poor and if you're struggling, it's because he doesn't like you very much. But if you work harder, he will love you more. It's a very interesting approach. We see that this region also didn't really have a problem with slavery, but to be fair, they also didn't have a lot of slaves. It's farther north, there's fewer reasons to have slavery, and again, no religious tolerance at all. You could be put to death for heresy under any number of situations. You could be called a heretic and a witch if you did so much as talk to an animal and expect it to talk back. Yeah, that was a thing. Roger Williams, who I told you earlier, we'll get to him. This is us getting to him. He gets in trouble in a Puritan community because they thought he was a threat to the social harmony that existed. Specifically, he said, hey, Native Americans, we've treated them pretty bad. It wasn't fair that we just took their land. And the other Puritans say, well, they're savages and they're not us, and it's so it's okay for us to treat them like this and treat them this bad. Williams believed, no, that's not fair, and we should treat all people equally, especially people who believe something different than us. So he got kicked out of Massachusetts. He goes to Providence and he starts a new colony there. He starts Rhode Island there. And one of the big things he brings with him in this new colony that he founds is the idea of complete religious tolerance. It didn't take long before this idea really started gaining traction in this region. One of the other big things we get is the idea of separation of church and state, because in Massachusetts, the church kind of was the state. And if you're elected to office, you're only in office for about 6 months if you're a legislator. And if you're a governor, you're only in office for a year. So you have to constantly be doing, either A, have to constantly be campaigning, or B, you have to constantly be doing the best you can for your people, so they will want you to be in charge longer. Connecticut is founded in the same year as Rhode Island. It's going to be put together by Reverend Thomas Hooker. He thought that Massachusetts was really kind of arbitrary in what they would do. The idea that they would use the Word of God to justify individual freedoms, he didn't agree with that. He didn't follow that at all. And that happens. The first official constitution in America actually comes out of Connecticut, and it said that, you have a representative body. You are a landowning individual. You have a voice in your government. You don't have to be in the church. And again, that's something that in Massachusetts you did have to be part of to participate in. Now, I know we talked about a lot of different parts of the country right now. This is just a general idea of where these different places are at. Don't worry, there's no geography test. I just want you to understand where they are. And all of this is happening in a really close proximity to each other. I mean, the difference between Providence, Rhode Island and Massachusetts and Salem is under 100 miles. The Pequot War began because of the death of a fur trader, a Native American Pequot fur trader. The English very quickly defeat the Pequots and either killed them or forced them into slavery. And after this, the colonists are going to again take more land from Native Americans. If you're in the South, you're growing stuff, tobacco most frequently. The farther north you go, growing stuff is not really the option for doing things. You're probably going to be making your money by either manufacturing something or trading something or fishing whaling. Now, there was great timber in New England, and back in Great Britain, in regular England, there wasn't. Most of the big trees, the tall straight pines, they had been lost by now and had been replaced with not prairies and grasslands more. But if you were a shipping empire, you need those ships and you need that timber. So this part of the world, that's where it's being used for. Fish, it's great. If you can't grow stuff, cool, go hunt it, go fish it. Cod is great. You can salt it in, it'll last for months. Whaling, you can go and hunt whales for whale oil and blubber, and if you don't have kerosene, that's at least an option. Trade becomes huge too, especially with the other different parts of the Americas, with the West Indies for sugar or indigo. All of this is happening. So even if my point is, the farther north you go, the more different options you have. The Halfway Covenant was this idea, and it had come into being over time. There were fewer and fewer people who thought you needed to be a church member to have a real place in society. And it was the grandchildren of the first people who would arrive in Massachusetts who said, we want a little more opportunity for this. And they got it. Back in England, there had been a conflict between the king, King Charles, and Parliament. You see, by this point, the king had lost a lot of his real power, and more power was in the hands of Parliament. Charles tried to take over and rule without them, and Parliament didn't like this. So, Charles gets an army, the Parliament gets an army, the two armies fight. Eventually, the king was defeated, and he himself was, well, killed. He was beheaded by the state. He was executed. The person who controls England after that is a man named Oliver Cromwell, and he acted as Lord Protector while Charles II, grew up a little bit. And during this time, we see that different religious groups are going to come into existence, predominantly wanting, number one, more religious toleration, and number two, when it was all said and done, the colonists still viewed themselves as English. I mean, this is one of the reasons that colonial America was so interesting. You have people who are thousands of miles away from a civil war who are still actively engaged in whose side is going to win. They do not see themselves as Americans. They do not see themselves as Rhode Islanders. They see themselves as English citizens who just happen to not live in England. Compared to other European nations, the English had more rights. They had more freedoms. A lot of people saw English colonization for themselves as better than what the French or what the Spanish were doing. They viewed the Spanish and French as tyrannical. Over time, we see that the Catholic Maryland had slowly transitioned to where more Protestants are in more power. Maryland's Act of Toleration said, hey, let's all be free, but it didn't extend to anyone who was not Christian. And finally, when Cromwell was in power, he would expand the power of England over Ireland and the Caribbean. So English forces are going to start trying to control these areas too. And finally passed the Navigation Acts, which were a series of laws that mandated how you could come to the Americas, what duties and taxes you had to pay. And again, all of this is under the controlling idea of the English state. So today we took a look at how England grew to become a colonial power. Hope you learned something today. I'll see you next time.